Netflix's Witcher is a jumbled mess of a show mired in controversy and poor reviews, and honestly, its current status is quite simply the result of the show's disjointed production team. And what I mean by that is no one on this show appears to be on the same page on what this thing should actually be trying to accomplish. For a franchise with as much banking on it for Netflix, you'd think the show was handled by a team that actually had a clear vision of the direction to take this thing in. But the sad reality is they don't. Everyone working on this show, from the writers to the directors to the actors, all have different ideas on what this show should be, and this causes some massive inconsistencies in the tone, spirit, and production value of the show. And I'm sure many already see where I'm going with this line of thinking, because one can't really talk about Netflix's The Witcher and not discuss Henry Cavill's departure from the role of Geralt after only 3 seasons, as Netflix recast him with Liam Hemsworth, a development that shocked the internet. Cavill's respect for the source material was often used in promotion, reinforcing how perfect he was in the role.
When I finally said, will you come in and actually read me some lines so I can actually hear your voice, not just in my head. When Henry left that day, it was myself and Sophie Holland and Alex Sakharov, our director, and we'd all just looked at each other and smiled, and we knew it was done.
In fact, in many ways, his passion was used as a shield against criticism of book inaccuracies.
To work with someone who loves the material as much as you do, and who wants to make sure that we're giving the fans the best, it truly is a dream come true.
One of my favorite things about Henry is how seriously he takes the job. He not only shows up prepared, knows Geralt inside and out, better than I do now. But he also shows up on time, ready to work with a great attitude. And to me, that's all I want at work every day. And so that partnership has just been amazing between us.
Are you sure about that?
But that's neither here nor there. The point is, Cavill's rendition of Geralt is usually cited as one of the few aspects of the show that unequivocally works, as he carries the rest of his production on his back through sheer adoration for the source material. But the reality is, his departure highlights some huge management issues with this show, as artistic divisions and lack of an overall creative drive for the show are undermining the work of everyone. And look, just so we're absolutely clear, I like Cavill as Geralt. His dedication to the role has been wonderful to see, and there are shimmers of greatness in his performance. But I also don't think he's great, in no small part because of the writing, sure, but also a bit due to his own approach to the adaptation process. And the reason for that is not that he's wrong for the character, but he is wrong for this show's interpretation of that character. The writer's ideas for Geralt are clearly different from Cavill's, and it creates this weird performance that never goes beyond being fun. When you listen to interviews, it's obvious that he wants to do right by the source material.
The important thing this season was to bring Geralt as close to the books as the vision and the plot would allow.
But that character is not the one the show is pushing forward, at least not yet. In the book, the character was your traditional scary-looking lone monster hunter archetype, but then Sapkowski subverted expectations and showed us he's actually a big softie who just likes hanging out with friends and genuinely cares for his adoptive daughter.
He's wise, he's been around, and he's a nice guy. It's his intentions are often, and that's the tragedy of the character, pure.
But in the show, we're getting an origin story for that character. Instead of him being this fully fledged protagonist with friendships and ideals already set in stone by the time he meets Ciri, the writers have him growing as a character as he changes through his interactions with her, Yennefer, Jaskier, and all his other friends that he meets along his adventures.
And to me, a character is only as interesting as the other people that he comes into conflict with or comes into love with. To me, find the character, learn the character, and then see how they change when they meet one another. That's the most exciting part. Especially because the story that we were telling, which is about what happens when a Witcher becomes a father figure, and how that changes who he is. And one of the things that he has to do is he has to start to express himself more.
They wanted him to be more active, and as such a big part of how they are writing the storylines is having Geralt evolve over the course of several seasons, as he learns to open up more and more and be more in tune with who he is thanks to his newfound friends and family.
What you have is a character who says, absolutely not, I'm a monster hunter, all I do is kill monsters, I'm okay being hated, I have no emotions, this is how I walk through the world. and we introduce him to a character who makes him question that.
The writers clearly want to show him slowly opening up over the course of the series.
For us, it's a really huge theme in our series, which is the idea of waking up into a new life, of rebirth.
You want to be with a character when they're going one direction and they're like, oh crap, we got to start going the other way. Because it brings in this whole new opportunity for the world. So now we have a character who is open to new things and is realizing that the path that he thought his life was going to take is changed now, and he starts letting new characters in and accessing his emotions a bit more. And to me, it was just such an explosive and exciting start to his journey.
For instance, they purposefully rewrote Geralt and Jaskier's genuine relationship from the books as a one-sided love-hate affair, with the Witcher irritated by the company of the other, but with time growing to understand him.
Jaskier thinks Geralt is his best friend in the world. Geralt doesn't necessarily feel the same about Jaskier.
It is one night bodyguarding your very best friend in the whole wide world. How hard could it be?
I'm not your friend.
He doesn't share details. He does not have friends.
Jaskier calls himself Geralt's best friend. I think Geralt would have a different point of view on that. What Jaskier brings to the surface is a lighter side of Geralt.
Pulling from Shrek and Donkey's dynamic.
Definitely a bit of a Shrek and Donkey relationship going on there.
Similarly, they transformed his relationship with Ciri from a loving bond between two people that wanted to be together into a distant connection forced onto them that grows into something more.
Geralt still has a tiny bit of a desire to be a hero. And so when he sees Nilfgaard marching towards Sintra, he starts to question whether or not his child that destiny has promised him is okay.
When you look at how much they describe him as the protector for this chosen child, it's pretty obvious which trope they're pulling from. They essentially turned Geralt into the Terminator to Ciri's John Connor.
Come with me if you want to live.
They want them to learn to trust each other, to understand each other, rather than their connection happening precisely because they are on the same wavelength.
What he's really trying to do is get Ciri to trust him, and that involves a great amount of vulnerability.
The point being, the show was supposed to start with a less expressive Geralt that over time became more verbose and closer to his book counterpart.
How do we start with a man who says, I'm only a monster killer and that's all I do, to someone who looks at his child of surprise and says, you're more than my destiny, you're much more than that.
Like I said, an origin story. And that's a major change for the character, giving him an actual arc of self-discovery when the books had it all happen years before the story even took place. And honestly, why not? It makes sense for a long-running series to want the character to develop over several seasons. I'm fine with making a less accurate adaptation if it makes for at least a decent original story. But the issue is that the showrunners didn't properly convey these goals to Cavill. He clearly signed on to perform the character from the games, and was seemingly unwilling to compromise for the sake of the show's overall package.
I'm the most annoying guy on set. Because I'm saying, excuse me, you do realize that this should be happening and they wouldn't do that, and you haven't read this, that means this would be impossible. And everyone's just going, Henry, just shut up and do the thing. And I'm like, I don't want to do the thing because he wouldn't do it this way, and he can do this.
Instead, he went out of his way to make his performance as close to the books as he could, even when it made no sense.
Some discussions about him sort of struggling with everything, and I thought, yeah, I mean, there's definitely going to be a different, this is a different turn for him.
Yeah.
But he's also wise. He's 70. He's probably seen a few children in his time. Yes, I wanted him to be warm.
And even though they were destined to be together, they have that hug. And then as you see in the first moments of season one, they're like, wait, who are you? How do I trust you? What do I do?
For instance, numerous times his Geralt refers to events that happened in the book, but never actually happened in the show due to the new direction the writers took the story in. Like when he claims,
Villain Trettenmath told us we were made for each other. Destined for each other. And that nothing would come of it. Because destiny alone is insufficient.
even though that only happened in the books. In the show, what he was told was,
The sorceress will never regain her womb. Though you didn't want to lose her, Geralt, you will.
Cavill is projecting aspects of the books into episodes through his improv, and it turns the show into an inconsistent mess where no matter how good his acting is, the character development is completely nonsensical. The story winds up being based on random disparate thoughts of the actors and writers with nothing coordinating towards telling a satisfying whole. But the most interesting case of this remains Roach's death in Season 2. The scene was personally rewritten by Cavill to include a paraphrased quote from Sword of Destiny, replacing a more comedic line, and people have used that as an example of the show's immature writing and of Cavill's ability to save it. But the reality is far more complex than that, because when Cavill rewrote the scene, it also completely changed its intent. Originally, the scene showed how Geralt was this tough, uncaring figure, but wanted to hide that from Ciri. He asked her to leave and then without hesitation puts down his horse. You could see him struggling to muster any sort of emotion.
You can tell that Geralt has maybe felt a bit too much and is incapable of processing everything that he's going through, and the only way that he knows how to deal with it is to fully isolate himself.
Because that was the writer's intention with the scene, to show that Geralt is cold and detached, but wants to be better for the sake of his daughter, which fits perfectly with the Terminator vibes they're going for. But then Cavill comes in and rewrites this as a heartfelt goodbye to his mount, and it doesn't mesh.
When it comes to emotional scenes like that, they become incredibly powerful for me personally.
The writers wanted this scene to tell us a lot about Geralt's relationship to Ciri and his struggles as a parent, but instead, it winds up telling us more about his relationship with Roach, and that loss of character development is all Cavill's fault, as he hijacked the script in order to cosplay as Geralt. That's the thing, on paper many of the choices made by the showrunners could have worked. Hissrich's pitch for the series, while not book accurate, is at least a solid standalone interpretation of this story. I mean, if you're gonna steal from something, there are worse things to plagiarize than Shrek and Terminator 2. Those movies are classics for a reason, but the execution is just not there, as Cavill's dedication to bringing to life the games undermined that direction. These tensions can be felt in every part of Cavill's performance. It says a lot that the part of the show he is most proud of is the one he had the heaviest hand in producing, where he personally hired a specific stunt coordinator to make the thing he wanted.
Wolfgang Stegemann and I worked together with his team to design that. We are very proud of that fight. It's storytelling. The characters exist within the action. We were very determined to do it our way.
He was literally taking the wheel away from the showrunners and doing things the way he wanted to do it, and it reveals a serious lack of teamwork for an industry that thrives on specialized artists. I also remember before the first season release seeing Cavill claim that Geralt's anchor to humanity was Roach, his horse, and feeling extremely confused.
But Roach is actually an essence of Geralt's, more like an anchor to Geralt's honest and true self. She's the one access point he has to humanity.
I mean,
Henry actually cast Roach himself because he really wanted to make sure that he, as an actor, felt the bond with the creature that Geralt is supposed to feel with Roach.
what? Geralt never cared for his horse. He literally called them all Roach because being on the road so much he constantly had to change mounts. So I couldn't understand Cavill's obsession with it until I watched the show, and suddenly it all made sense. The reason Cavill insisted on this connection is because they removed all his other anchors to humanity. Dandelion, Yennefer, Ciri, Yarpen, his relationships with all of them have been reduced to professional respect at best. Seriously, can you picture Cavill's Geralt breaking down and sharing his fears to a random priestess? Picture him moving in with Yennefer for a few months, telling Ciri a story to go to sleep? Of course not, because that's not how he's been characterized.
Tell me a story, she snorted. How am I supposed to sleep without a story? I mean, really? He laughed again, put his hands under his head, and looked up at the stars, twinkling beyond the branches above their heads. There was once a cat.
I sleep like shit, too.
You don't sleep at all.
Makes a few nightmares.
All this humanity he could show in the books doesn't exist here, and he's instead depicted as a lone wanderer who struggles to open himself to anyone. But because Cavill still wants his Geralt to be emotionally intelligent, we have to compromise, and having him care for his horse like he did not in the books, but like in the games, was the way to bring that forward. It was Cavill's way to show that his Geralt is not an emotionless robot, but actually has the depth of his book counterpart, somewhere deep beneath the surface.
I really wanted to make sure we had a three-dimensional version of the character.
rather than a two-dimensional, just grumpy snowman living in the mountains.
But it's so obviously half-hearted, with only a handful of scenes being added here and there. Outside of the pilot, Geralt never really talks to Roach. Honestly, most of their interactions feel like Cavill improvising after the horse did something unexpected. And that's because the long-term plans for the show require him to be dispassionate before meeting his new family.
For the first time, he has to learn how to take care of somebody else. For him, it's a journey to uncover his own feelings.
When you listen to the reasoning behind Geralt's grunts, it seems obvious Cavill was stuck between a rock and a hard place, trying to give his character depth when the writing was clearly not supporting that.
I played the season one way deliberately, which was him out in the wilds and without the opportunity for vast swathes of dialogue. It's, I thought, best be the man who says less, because that seems like he's thinking more. We're working within the framework of the show. Lawrence brought her own vision and her own lens, and so I spoke a lot less. And I wanted to lend a gravitas and have that essence of who the character is, which is a very direct, very cold, straightforward person. But he never really started that way in the book. He only ended up that way at the end of each conversation. Of course. And so I had to cut straight to the chase and then add nuance throughout the 8 hours of storytelling.
And it led to a performance even he was displeased with.
Because with the enhanced storylines all around, you can't quite get into the nuance and the complication of who Geralt is like the books do. Initially came across as he was just grumpy all the time with everyone and everything, and I really wanted to show this three-dimensional character. There's a lot of complexity to Geralt, and you see a lot of that in the books. Some of that doesn't necessarily translate to the show, because due to the nature of there being fantastic storylines which are existing alongside Geralt, it had to boil down to the very essence of who he was.
And this issue is made all the more obvious by how tokenistic scenes depicting his friendships are, as they are clearly introduced to alleviate Cavill's demands, but not because it makes sense for the story the show is telling.
That was important to me, to show that he does have these connections with the people and things that he loves.
Any character Geralt cares for or has existing relationships with are one-off characters. Characters like Mousesack and Nivellen, with whom he has no relationships in the books because they were nothing more than acquaintances he crossed paths with briefly. And the reason they reallocated his friendships to these random side characters is so the writers can exclaim, "Look, he totally has friends," but then write them out after an episode or two. They can sweep Geralt's bond to them under the rug and still emphasize this narrative that he's learning to tune into his emotions, because these friendships were meaningless in the scope of the story. This is why we never get to see Geralt's reactions to Mousesack or Remus's death, even though they're supposed to be amongst his oldest friends, because the writers want you to view him as detached and aloof.
You two clearly weren't acquainted.
So they ignore the bonds he does have. It makes for some really weak characterization that's trying to both have its cake and eat it. The writers wanted to do their dispassionate take on the character, which is diametrically opposed to the book counterpart, and instead of committing to that, compromise by having him have his personality from the source material, but only when off screen. Seriously, they have admitted to cutting scenes where he did express himself in a verbose fashion in the editing room, which is a pretty literal representation of how these writers treat the character. They let Cavill play the book character and then just chop up his performance in the editing room to give us their different take, instead of just having the performer play the role as they would like from the start. It's kind of fascinating, like seeing a train split between two tracks that are inevitably drifting apart. This thing is bound for derailment sooner rather than later, as Cavill tried to bring to life a character that didn't fit the story that writers were telling. Cavill was butting heads with the showrunners, often going behind their backs to bring his character closer to the books and especially the games. In a way, he took advantage of their leniency towards him to slowly but surely affect his performance to be less what the creators intended and more what he and the fans wanted.
I had the good fortune of working with Lauren, who was so wonderfully such an open book when it came to us discussing the character and to how he was going to look and how we're going to adapt it.
If you think relative newcomers like Anya Charlotta and Freya Allen were given that much say in what they could and couldn't do on set, then boy, I got some news for you. It's no wonder the showrunner's working relationship with Cavill fell apart. Imagine the stress he placed on producers by deciding midway through production he wanted to change how he would play the character.
And I said, do you want me to put a bit of rasp to my voice or anything? Right. They're like, no, just your normal voice. I was like, oh, okay, cool. And I was like, that's a cool way to go. I I found throughout shooting, there was one, I think it was episode 3, it's actually King Foltest, that scene where I lock everyone out of the room and walk back in.
Yeah.
I didn't do that intentionally. That happened by accident. And that was after the Christmas break. And then afterwards I was like, oh my God, I just played a whole scene in the wrong voice. I did my own thing, and then I spoke to Alec and I spoke to Lauren, and they both said, yeah, it's okay actually, if you want to do that, we can go with that, and we'll do the rest, redo the rest.
Or the confusion his co-stars must have gone through when he would improvise on set, as he would literally refuse to say lines.
None of the grunts were in there. All the grunts I either added or I didn't say anything and just grunted instead. And it was often up to the other actors to go, I think he's not going to say anything now. And so I think the grunts were often a surprise for anyone who was watching.
It can't have been an ideal work environment, as the creatives and performers were fighting a cold war against each other.
He does all his own stunts, which is a producer's worst nightmare.
And the fact that his acting choices probably stem from his bias towards the games make it a lot harder for me to purely take his side here.
My introduction to the character first came through the games. I'm a big PC gamer, and I've been gaming since I was a young boy.
I'm a big gamer, and so I had played the games a lot.
Played that game to the death.
I'm a big gamer. I've played the games a lot. Many hours put into those, and
Much has been said about how much of a nerd Cavill is, but the truth is, I don't believe it's helping. I'm sure he loves the franchise, but at the same time, when he was cast, he didn't even know the books existed yet.
Because I actually hadn't read the books until Lauren had mentioned them to me. Yeah. So Lauren introduced me to the books. And I was like, oh my goodness me, I thought the books were like a play off the games because they all had the game cover on.
When Cavill joined the project, he was there to adapt the video game version of the character.
I don't know if anyone here is a gamer or anything, if everyone's played the games, but super immersive. And when I was playing it, I always thought it'd make a great movie or TV show.
Very, very passionate about the games. I did play them a lot, and every time I played the games, I just thought, I really hope they make this into a movie or a TV show or something.
And as such, his entire performance is mired by that bias towards CD Projekt's version of the character. It's why his Geralt uses signs in combat, why he mumbles to himself like Batman, why he has a strong relationship with Roach. Even though that didn't happen in the books, that's what Game Geralt did. But there, the changes were explicitly for the benefit of the player, to enhance gameplay and improve pacing by reducing interruptions for the player. Ultimately, the game version of Geralt was less defined as a character because they were RPGs and they needed to leave room for the players to influence his characteristic. But that shouldn't be happening in this TV show that only has one storyline playing out. With Cavill, these limitations originally made for logistical reasons are just a burden that makes his rendition of the character seem more dull-witted than anything.
As I'm sure you know in the books, he's an amateur philosopher, he's an intellectual, he's wise and thoughtful. But it's important for me to have the character be three-dimensional.
I didn't get that sense at all from the episodes that I watched, Mason. But
just a big grunty man?
Just a big grunty man.
Yeah.
Cavill is playing Geralt the same way the games depicted him, but in a medium where he has far less screen time and you lose the interactive dimension.
With the shift of the showrunner's vision where it's an ensemble cast more so than a singular lead, and the perspective is shifted to be almost more of a Cirilla Yennefer perspective. And so it's about finding my character's place within that vision.
Yet he still insists on channeling the game counterpart's mannerisms. He wasn't adjusting the role to the medium he was in. He was just injecting the game character into the show with no consideration of how and why decisions were implemented in the adaptation process.
Getting into that bath, I was sitting there thinking, I wonder if anyone knows how much this is going to explode, this particular scene. So I was trying to put my feet up, and I couldn't. The bath was the wrong shape.
It's like he was in his own bubble, ignoring the show he was in, tunnel visioning towards what he experienced as a gamer.
I mean, I was a huge fan of the games, and I've been doing this now, acting for 21 years. And so whenever I'm doing things like playing great computer games, I'm thinking, can I turn this into a movie? Can I turn it into a TV show? How would I do it?
His performance winds up being nothing more than a Doug Cockle impression, reducing his rendition of the character to an adaptation of an adaptation.
I drew inspiration from Doug Cockle, who voiced him for the games.
I've done
a version of the voice which he did.
Of course his version feels shallow.
The video games are an adaptation of the books, so I don't really want to do an adaptation of the source material.
And he apparently never played the DLCs for Witcher 3, which contains some of the high points of CD Projekt's trilogy, so his impression is incomplete anyways.
I may go back to Blood and Broken Bone and then have a go at it again because I haven't finished the expansions.
He clearly loves the source material, but I also believe his performance is actually hindered by his experience of the games, as he tries to replicate a popular performance rather than bring a unique twist to the character that would mesh with the showrunner's visions.
It's about making sure I play my part in it, but also maintaining my love and belief for the fantasy and the books, and indeed the games, because the stuff which CD Projekt Red did, absolutely stunning, and they set the bar super high for when it comes to everything Witcher. It's about finding that place in there where I can do both.
Imagine if Heath Ledger had just decided to imitate Mark Hamill's performance for his rendition of the Joker in The Dark Knight, as opposed to making something that fit the script the Nolan brothers wrote. I'm not saying it would make for a bad performance, in fact it would probably be very popular among fans, but it would be far less memorable and ultimately less iconic. The end result of all these compromises is Cavill is not performing the Geralt from the games. Instead, he's the Geralt from the trailer for the games, the version that will say a badass line and act all tough and intimidating after. The cookie-cutter himbo that has 3 minutes to give off the air of a gruff hero archetype.
Both die! Blame destiny.
What are you doing?
Killing monsters.
You know, the version the games actually made fun of?
Don't know who you're trying to impress. Tough guy stuff's just not working on me.
Look who's talking. Vesemir told me about that job you did for those Nilfgaardians in Velen. What? What are you doing? Killing monsters. Good one.
Just came out that way.
This is the thing about Cavill's Geralt. He can't be the character from the books or the games he wanted to play, nor can he be the character the showrunners want, leading to a performance that's fun enough, but never really goes beyond being a big-budget cosplay.
I do everything I can to be as faithful to the source material as possible that I can be within the structure set out for me.
It makes the character feel incredibly one-note and lacking any depth. It's not surprising his most famous line is,
Fuck. Oh, fuck.
Really, the show gave us nothing more than a superpowered mutant. When Cavill says stuff like this in interviews,
Geralt of Rivia is almost like a blend of Superman and Batman.
Yeah. It really shows where the priorities of the show are. It's all in the spectacle, the cool fights and detective action, and far less the actual human side. When there is conflict on how the character should be portrayed, you can't focus on who he is, only on what he does, which is a lot easier to settle on. He's a badass monster hunter. That everyone can agree on. It's everything else that's missing. Cavill's Geralt winds up being nothing more than a superhero in a fantasy setting.
Henry had his way. I think he would have been in basically a black version of his Superman suit because that's what he just wanted to sort of body stop him.
Which, given the background of the writing team and Cavill's for that matter, it's not all that surprising.
So that's all life is to you? Monsters and money?
It's all it needs to be.
But that's a horrible reduction of the character. The appeal of Geralt is seeing this terrifying and intimidating tank of a man, only to realize he's actually a really well-spoken softie who just wants to hang out with friends. It was one of the main points of the whole series, to not judge a book by its cover. Geralt is not some himbo who communicates only in growly macho soundbites. He's not Batman, but that's what they made him into. Just like the show took the facade of the cold-hearted woman that Yennefer put forward and made it her defining trait, so did it take the strong silent type front Geralt put forward and made it his defining feature. They aren't putting a new spin on the character, nor are they doing a good adaptation. They're just reducing a complex and interesting character into a boring, easily digestible archetype, because neither side is letting a specific vision shine. And it's sad because clearly they did try to find a solution.
And we talked about who his Geralt would be and how it differed from the games and what he had learned from the books and what he was starting to see in the scripts.
It's about finding my character's place within the overall vision of the showrunner. The showrunner has a particular vision for the show and for the characters in the show. And so it's about finding my character's place within that vision.
There are enough interviews showing they look to find that balance between what Cavill wanted and what the showrunners wanted, but the truth is, the two were just incompatible from the start. The producers wanted to boil down Geralt to his basics so they could build him up into the more complex character from the books, while Cavill wanted to be that more complex character immediately. The two ideas were fundamentally at odds, and that clearly increasingly frustrated Cavill, who just tried to make the best of a bad situation.
What changes did you want? There's only so much that I can change when it comes to a new season. I can't change plot lines, I can't change storylines.
Right.
I can't even really change character trajectory. There's only so much control I have. I can't control plot lines, storylines, even character direction. But what I can do is have as much influence as I possibly can upon my character.
The best scenes in the show are precisely the ones involving Geralt finally opening up and showing his emotional side to people he previously treated coldly, because the writers finally get to frame the story the way they want to, as a story of emotional growth, and Cavill finally gets to play the wise character he originally signed on for. These are the rare moments where the two ideas finally line up, and it kind of works. Geralt's characterization in the second season is by far the best thing this show has ever had going for it, revealing that his acting and this arc set up for him could have worked with a solidified, unified vision.
He and I had a lot of amazing conversations about Geralt and how we needed him to shift in season 2. So there's a lot less grunting this season, and a lot more actually explaining how he feels.
But due to the differences on the team, the build-up and development to get to this point was shoddy at best and downright missing at worst. Geralt's growth doesn't feel natural at all and seems to be more the result of the writers satisfying Cavill's demands. Yeah, it's great that the character is closer to the book counterpart now, but if how we get there feels contrived, is it worth it? Maybe, but it still makes for the weakest rendition of the character out there. And again, that is just as much on the writers, who completely deconstructed the character until he was nothing more than a himbo, as it is on Cavill, whose choices undermined the narrative arc the writers were setting up for him. If it sounds like I'm both praising Cavill's performance and defending some choices made by Hissrich here, it's because I am. As much as I despise what the team has done with the franchise, I'm also capable of admitting when certain decisions could have been good. Neither side was wrong in wanting to bring a specific version of Geralt to the screen, but the showrunners were wrong to hire Cavill when his vision for the character didn't mesh with their own. Cavill wanted ownership over how Geralt should be depicted, not played, depicted, and it hurt the show overall.
When I dream of doing my own fantasy saga like movies or TV shows, the visuals are a major aspect of it. When you are just a carriage on someone else's train, it can be a dangerous place to be in. When you are the train itself, when you are the Peter Jackson, when you are the Zack Snyder, when you are the Denis Villeneuve, it is, I'm sure, absolutely amazing because it's your vision. The scary thing is when you're someone who's so into details and an almost psychopathic lore loyalist like I am, especially when it comes to fantasy and sci-fi, then it can be a double-edged sword being just a carriage on the train.
I'm actually surprised you haven't produced yet.
The time will come.
Yeah.
The time will come. It is something which I'm very excited about doing and something that's important to me. I want to be there from the beginning of things and to guide the ship from the get-go. If you believe what you're doing is the right thing, then you'll be able to keep on doing it. It's also important to know that if you realize you're doing the wrong thing, that's when you stop doing the wrong thing. You don't just keep on going just because that leads down a dark path.
Cavill clearly had a specific image of what this show should be, and that inevitably put him at odds with the showrunners. He might love the source material and get the character, but letting him course correct the entire show was the wrong decision, as it only undermined the narrative arc the writers planned for him. I can admit that, even as a fan who wishes we got a book-accurate adaptation. The showrunner should be driving this train. Sure, the actor can provide feedback, but he should not be the reason entire aspects of the show are rewritten. I don't care how committed to the role Cavill is. I don't care that he wore the costume for weeks on end, that he never left set, or that he became the character. He's not performing Geralt in a way that fits the long-term plans for the show. If the character he becomes is wrong for the series, then the producers shouldn't let him become that, regardless of the source material. Either make an alternate take on the franchise, or make a book-accurate show. That's the point. Pick one lane or the other. But the team never did, opting to go for a middle ground that is unsatisfying to everyone.
So even if you didn't nail it the first time, you can start to adjust, you can start to tweak, you can start to sort of caress it into something which does honor to the amazing material that Sapkowski created.
Yeah.
And with Cavill's departure, this is all the more obvious. He promised he'd stick for 7 seasons if the writing continued to respect Sapkowski's work, only months before dropping out. His vision for the character was at its very core at odds with the show he was actually in, as the writer's new spin on the brand was clearly drifting away from the source material. I will always appreciate Cavill for attempting to do right by the fan. I respect that he tried to bring the character from the books to life, but the truth is, that character had no place in this show. Too much has been changed from plot points to thematics and morals, and so when Cavill tries to perform the books, it feels restricted and undermines the new spin on the story being told, leaving us with nothing. Not a good adaptation, and not a good new take on the source material. Just a bad, shallow show. Who's to blame for this? I don't know. Probably Hissrich and the producers for hiring someone they didn't work well with. Because right now, no one is happy with this outcome. Not the actors.
How do you feel like they feel about each other at the end of the season?
I don't know. It's tricky.
It's a tricky one.
Not the showrunners.
Od nich potem zależy i oni będą potem oceniani, jak ta postać wypada na ekranie. Jeżeli ona ma w sobie jakiś fałsz, jeżeli ta postać nie jest w jakiś tam sposób zsynchronizowana z aktorem, który ją gra, czy aktor, który ją gra, nie chce grać tej postaci, bo jej nie czuje, to kończy się to zazwyczaj tragedią.
Not even the fans who now have to watch one of the few enjoyable parts of the show leave. And if this was just a one-time thing, an unfortunate misguided choice by the showrunners that backfired horribly, I could forgive it. Who wouldn't be taken in by Cavill's enthusiasm and long-term commitment to the role, especially when he was willing to take a sizable pay cut despite his status as a bona fide star? That probably played a major part in the producer's decision to hire him, even if it was perhaps not the best decision, as they thought they'd eventually find a common ground to stand on. But the truth is, such departures over creative differences are the norm for this show, not the exception. While Henry Cavill was undoubtedly the highest profile individual to drop from this show, team members have been leaving since before season 1 even aired. Whether it be producers, costume designers, actors, every aspect of this production has seen people move on to other things. And that tells me that the issue is not that the showrunners couldn't convince Henry Cavill to embrace their vision for the show, and more so that the showrunners keep hiring people that disagree with their vision. Don't believe me? Fine. Here's Alex Sakharov, who directed several episodes of hugely successful TV shows such as Game of Thrones, Ozark, and The Americans, had to say about his experience working on The Witcher as both a director and a producer. I judged my work quite critically there. The producers set the task of setting the adaptation at an action pace and filling it with colorful special effects. That was their vision. My vision was very different, and I tried to convey it to them, giving my arguments. Unfortunately, I was not considered convincing enough, so I decided to leave the project. He gets it's first and foremost about characters, and he wanted to bring that to the screen, but the producers were not interested in creating an adaptation. What they were looking to make was a show with mass appeal, which is shitty, but not uncommon. What is odd is why would they hire a director and producer who fundamentally disagreed with that vision? It's only going to cause serious issues, and you just need to look at the pilot to realize how serious the repercussions are. Sakharov was originally supposed to direct episodes 1, 2, 7, and 8, but wound up only fully shooting episode 2. Mark Jobst helmed reshoots of most of the episodes he was supposed to work on, most famously the pilot. The original actress for Renfrey, Millie Brady, was not available to do additional photography and was promptly replaced by Emma Appleton, meaning most, but not all, of Sakharov's work is now gone, and as such the pilot serves as a perfect benchmark of what Sakharov wanted the show to be compared to what it became. For the sake of simplicity, we will simply consider the scene with Stregobor as the only remaining aspect of Sakharov's pilot, something evident by how Geralt's costume, wig, and his entire demeanor changes. While stuff involving Renfrey are part of the Mark Jobst reshoots. And don't get me wrong, in and of themselves, reshoots are fine. They're a common aspect of the industry. Game of Thrones' pilot was also completely reshot, and Appleton did a great job. She's probably the best actor in the whole show, but at the same time, the change of directors and script resulted in some weird discrepancies within the episode's narrative and production design. For instance, they have Geralt realize Renfri is going to the market for reasons that are never quite clear, only for the ensuing fight to distinctly not take place in a market. And this weird discrepancy is because the scenes Sakharov shot were actually filmed in a market, but then the reshoots had to hack something together by reusing a different set from episode 4 to stay within budget. And that would be awkward enough on its own, but the change actually had some pretty pronounced ramifications on the narrative of the episode, because the absence of a crowded market completely changes the nature of Renfri's plan. In the books, the fact that her men were in a crowded market was integral to the plot, as they planned to enact what they called a tridem ultimatum. They were dispersed with hidden blades, ready to strike at civilians on her signal in order to get what they wanted. The point of this story was for Geralt to realize that not intervening was the same as letting civilians die. Throughout the tale, Geralt's speech of
Evil is evil, Stregobor. Lesser, greater, middling. It's all the same.
Is slowly deconstructed. By the end, our protagonist's belief in complete neutrality is proven to be lofty-minded bullshit, as he realizes that's impossible. Doing nothing is still taking a side, so he does choose an evil. He does make the decision to save civilians rather than letting a slaughter occur. And yeah, he can never be sure if he did the right thing, but he comes to the conclusion that feeling guilt due to acting on what he believes is right is better than feeling guilt knowing he could have done something and didn't. That's the point of the story. Geralt didn't kill Renfri because he chose Stregobor's side, he did it because it was better than the alternative. In the end, non-committed to a conflict side does not mean inaction. This story is about Geralt realizing that for better or for worse, he can't sit on the sidelines, to the point that he will later come to find that
neutrality. Neutrality is always contemptible.
It's not what some misinformed YouTubers will tell you that taking a side is wrong. That interpretation is based on a single line by Renfri and ignores everything else said throughout the rest of the 8 books. What most people miss about Geralt's character is that he isn't neutral, even if he claims to be. By his own admission, the Witcher Code is a fabrication that doesn't actually exist.
Those who follow a code are often respected and held in high esteem. But no one's ever compiled a Witcher's Code. I invented mine, just like that, and keep to it. Always. Not always.
What he actually is impartial. He'll consider both sides equally, then get involved. Geralt does believe in a lesser evil. He literally winds up dying in a pogrom standing for what he believes is right. Despite what he claims, Geralt can't stand on the sideline, and this story is supposed to be the one that demonstrates exactly why that is, as he gives up the simplicity of neutrality and instead accepts the responsibility of impartiality. But in the show, due to the context of all the Renfri scenes getting changed in reshoots, these dynamics are all wrong. He doesn't choose the lesser evil of killing a few thugs to save civilians, because as far as we know, no civilians were in danger.
I don't know that it was a choice for Geralt to kill Renfri. I think in that moment he acted out of pure instinct.
The crowd is straight up absent as the thugs attack Geralt, and only Geralt, in an empty alley. And last we knew, Renfri was gonna skip town anyways.
Tomorrow I'll leave Baviken. For good.
She only says this
I will kill everyone here until Stregobor comes down.
after the fight already broke out. So why did Geralt even go to confront her in the first place? The simple answer is because a vision told him to, which is about as lazy as you can get when writing a script. The director only had 1 day to reshoot a scene that originally took 3, and as a result of that, probably opted to remove the crowd. It would have been too much work to figure out the new choreography while also wrangling a group of extras, and so they opted to cut them, but that defeats the whole point of Renfri's plan, and of Geralt's decision to return to stop her. Due to how disorganized and rushed the reshoots were, the episode winds up making it seem like he is attacking Renfri to stop her from killing Stregobor, rather than to save civilians, which is an absolute failure of adaptation and general storytelling. In fact, for some reason, the director purposefully played into that confusion. As Jobst puts it, I guess Renfri always hoped that Geralt might choose to come with her in her fight with Stregobor, but he didn't. So from her point of view, he did choose. According to the director, Geralt took no side, so Renfri just assumed he sided against her. Instead of having our hero actually take a stand against her and believe in something despite his supposed neutrality, they really just reduced their battle to,
if you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
And called it quits. And the reasons for this dumbing down of the story are twofold. First, Jobs has admitted to not reading the books, meaning he was basing his interpretation of the story on nothing more than the script he was being sent. And that would be bad enough on its own, but on top of that, the script was constantly being changed, adding to the confusion. According to stunt coordinator Vladimír Furdik, the pilot was rewritten at least 9 times.
Robím Witchera, tak zmenili scénář už asi 9krát.
Older versions included the introduction to Yennefer's storyline and flashbacks to Renfri's childhood, for instance, to the point you can still see a clip of that in the show's teaser. The original shoot also had Renfri's band played by actors instead of stuntmen, indicating their plan was probably more developed there. So yeah, it's unsurprising the entire thematic heart is messy and unfocused when it's stitched together with scenes shot by Sakharov with one script, and others shot by Jobs with a completely different script, with some major cuts being made in the editing room.
Texty.
Aha, repliky.
Alebo, keď nestíhajú, tak si pozrú scenár. Toto nemusíme mať, toto roztrhneme, keď nestíhajú. Vieš, takže takto to...
No wonder Jobs couldn't get a handle on the thematic core of the episode. And the end result is even the lead actor was confused as to what the episode was even supposed to be about. Hisrik's whole goal here was to show how Geralt regrets his neutrality led to Renfri's death.
So I chose a story called The Last Wish, which to me sort of puts him up against a character named Renfri and challenges his worldview. So basically we get to meet the Witcher, we get to hear how he exists in the world, what he thinks his role is, how he feels about it, and then we immediately challenge it and make him rethink that.
Geralt feels a connection to her because of their shared status as mutants.
They created me just as they created you. We're not so different.
We're not so different, you and I. Very clever.
That makes him question his belief that he should be dispassionate when dealing with those society claims are monsters such as her.
So I wanted a story that changed Geralt's journey, that took everything that he had been doing and he was really sort of, stuck in his ways and he was only living for his job and he was very clear on the boundaries of his job. And then in this short story, he meets a character named Renfri who changes everything for him.
And that guilt of failing a mutant he felt a connection to changes him, as he keeps Renfri's brooch as a reminder that if he avoids conflict, victims like Renfri will suffer.
Renfri's brooch actually is something that Geralt carries with him for the rest of the series, and he sort of uses it as his guiding principle of whether or not to take action.
Geralt, throughout the rest of the season, carries Renfri's death with him. In fact, he carries more than that. He carries the brooch that she's wearing when she dies, so that he is never without her, and the reminder that she gives him, which is to find humanity.
But apparently, Cavill seems to think it's the complete opposite.
The addition of Renfri's brooch on the hilt signifies Geralt's reinforcement of his beliefs that he shouldn't get involved in the affairs of men, because they always lead to his own personal pain.
So who the fuck knows what the lessons of this episode are supposed to be? This is the insane thing. Attempting to analyze anything around this episode, or this show in general, is completely pointless, when not even the people who work on it seem to agree on its themes and lessons. Character arcs are incongruous, and messages become transparently hollow. Director, the writer, and the actor all had different interpretations of what the episode was even trying to say, and it leads to an incomprehensible mess that's more confusing than any multiple timeline gimmick ever could be. How are you supposed to relate to anything when this ship is sailing with no clear direction? The Witcher books are complicated things, strutting the line between many different tones that shouldn't mesh together, from heartbreaking tragedy to dark comedy to raunchy slapstick to social commentary. That has always been Sapkowski's strength as a writer, to blend these seemingly incompatible moods into a harmonious whole that ultimately reflects the variety of life. The end result is a franchise that is a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
It's a game, it's a book, it's a TV show, it's plenty of things. It's very, very hard to just box Witcher into a very simple explanation.
So to adapt that, one would need to make sure everyone was on the same page on when and where to capture different aspects to form a cohesive whole. Yet they never did in the case of the show. None of the aspects of production were approached in a holistic fashion, leading to each team bringing in the aspects of the books they personally cared for at the expense of, telling a well-thought-out story with stakes and fully realized characters. If they were making changes to the books on purpose, I could accept it, but it really seems to be the result of production being a disorganized mess that saw the focus of the episode constantly shift rather than a choice on the creative's part. The directors were working on a tight schedule, trying to put something together without having time to figure out how it would all come together. Sets were changed, actors recast, and extras removed for no other reason than to fit that production timeline. So instead, the team focused again on what Geralt does rather than why he does it.
The moment where Geralt is faced with these brigands with Renfri's gang. And I think it's interesting because we've teased at what Geralt can do, but at this moment we haven't seen what he can do.
They made sure the emotional action scene would wow people at the cost of the actual reasons for it. Here we see the separation between the slower-paced Sakharov wanted, which presumably would have been more interested in Geralt's conflict and the Trident ultimatum, and the special effects laden one the showrunners strive for that reduced the ultimatum to these two lines.
You gave me an ultimatum, and I find they work.
You have to choose the lesser evil. It's an ultimatum. Get it?
The reshoots were literally done for no other reason than to reimagine this fight. They were more interested in getting this big battle right than they were in properly setting up its conflict. And it leads to a final result that's not necessarily wrong in how it approaches the themes of the books, but it is confusing to newcomers and lacks any of the actual depth found in the source material. Without the context of the fight, it doesn't matter how good this fight looks or how much work you put into making it say something about the characters. It will still feel empty, serving as nothing more than a demonstration of Geralt's superpowered abilities.
You get to see Geralt in motion. And when he's going, when he's moving, it is like a dance. And you see him it's a non-stop assault on Renfri when he decides to put her in her place.
Sakharov clearly understood this, leading him to step down in frustration. And the constant shift in leaderships, presumably born from creative differences, means that the actual thematic underpinnings of the episode were completely unclear, as we wound up with vastly different interpretations of the story mushed together until everything felt half-baked.
Never half-ass two things. Whole-ass one thing.
And these types of problems, where the different intent of the directors and writers seemingly found themselves at odds, are true all throughout. For instance, let's look at Yennefer's storyline. As I've explained, it's supposed to show her downward spiral, as she gets taken in by the lies of Aretuza, sacrificing who she is to find a place in a patriarchal system. Here, Yennefer gets taken in and is willing to sacrifice her friends for the sake of power, yet it's framed like this.
Toss a coin to your witcher, a friend of humanity.
And here, where she sacrifices her ability to bear children for a reward that will bring her nothing, yet it's framed like this. Do you see where I'm going with this? These scenes are framed as heroic accomplishments, with epic music and cinematography that frames the character as victorious, when the writing is telling us the opposite. There is a complete disconnect in how dramatic scenes are shot and what they are trying to say, because the direction is framing the character as she was in the books, someone who loved being a sorceress and saw it as the source of good in her life. But the writers didn't write that character. They wrote a character who sold her soul to a messed up system, as she is doomed to an accursed life she winds up not wanting. And the end result is this confusing mess where I can barely even tell what the scene is trying to convey. Am I supposed to be horrified to see Yennefer getting placed in a box as Aretuza's rules begin dictating her life? Or am I supposed to be impressed by her newfound confidence in her metaphorical rebirth? I don't know, because quite clearly the people working on this show didn't know either. Some saw this scene as a positive, like in the books, while others had this far more pessimistic outlook on the whole thing. And I've also discussed at length how Ciri and Geralt's meeting is presented in a way that does not coincide with the show's timeline of events. It's all the same issue. The directors depict the scenes as this huge emotional culmination like it was in the books, with slow motion reactions and touching music. But within the context of the show's script, by the writer's own admission, the scene is no longer that. So the end result is these messy scenes where no emotion ever feels genuine. Even minor characters get completely messed up by this. In Season 1, Fringilla and Cahir's dynamic is that of a manipulative witch exploiting the weak soldiers through religious zealotry. She is shown whispering ideas into his ear, pushing him to find Ciri and commit acts of violence for the sake of their emperor, while herself performing forbidden magic.
cannot mistake the stars reflecting in the pond for those in the night sky.
Spare me the lecture, Fringilla.
I witnessed the white flame call on you. She is the key. But you are the commissioner. Cirilla may already be across the Yaruga. This is our chance to honor the white flame.
The Guardian Empire is still sort of backwater, kind of nothing. You know, it's not a strong state or anything. Suddenly, with Fringilla's help, it becomes this huge sort of menace.
The implication in season 1 was that she was pushing for the Nilfgaardian invasion. But then suddenly, in season 2, all these dynamics are flipped on their head. She barely cares about Ciri. Turns out Cahir was the one manipulating her to submit to the Emperor.
Like of your friend, Cahir. You're different with him around. Not afraid, perhaps, but smaller.
He was my superior.
I know you well enough to understand that you did not forsake the mission the White Flame gave us. You just got a little distracted.
They wrote her a redemption arc, but instead of actually crafting one, they just changed her character entirely from a cutthroat, ambitious witch out for revenge to a scared girl trying to survive a bad situation. Like, seriously, just compare how her uncle Artorius talks about her in season 1.
To be fair, Yennefer of Vangerberg is the one that I have to thank for my posting. If she'd taken it, I wouldn't be where I am today. Neither would Nilfgaard.
If only Yennefer had gone to Nilfgaard. With her at the helm, they'd still be a shitty backwater.
Versus season 2.
Apologize as well.
For aligning with Nilfgaard. Of course.
For believing that you could have any impact there at all, my dear.
It's diametrically opposed characterization. The writers have gone on record saying they never saw Fringilla as a religious zealot. And that's great, but...
Perhaps if Nilfgaard's religious zeal had been tempered earlier. This isn't who you are.
The white flame made me who I am. Gave me a higher purpose. Do you know how Nilfgaard took Sintra? Horrible storm. 50 Skelligan ships sunk to the bottom of the sea. Wrecked in that horrible fog. That was you.
That's not what was on screen, ever, during the first season. Once again, because the showrunners and writers didn't properly convey their goals to the directors, the vision is completely bungled. The directors read the script and saw Fringilla as this monstrous manipulator driven by her bitterness towards Yennefer that wishes to get back at those who wronged her in her youth. So that's what we saw on screen for the first season.
Without rules or restrictions, I will personally deplete them until they are empty and powerless. I don't need your help anymore, Rectress.
But the writers envisioned the character very differently, as this traumatized girl trying to find her way in a world that screwed her. But that only comes through a season later, probably after they realized how much they messed up. And so the writing and direction come to a head in a way that makes the character feel completely inconsistent from season to season.
And we will spread his supremacy all through the kingdoms, whether they deserve it or not. People, they see our black armor and they assume that we are here to destroy the world. But we're not. We are trying to feed, to house, to liberate.
When later seasons try to redeem her, it's unearned since we're not forgiving the character for her actions and behaviors. Instead, all we are forgiving is what the writers want you to remember. This doesn't work. This isn't nuanced. This isn't peeling back facets of the characters that were previously hidden. Because when you rewatch season 1, the scenes don't find new meaning. There's no change in perspective. Future seasons don't recontextualize earlier scenes and explain the subtleties behind the actor's performance. And how could they? Not even the actors know where their characters are heading.
It's about that arc, and also completely trusting that journey and trusting that you don't need to know how it's resolved now. Sometimes I remember I would have an idea in my head of what I think a scene may look like for her, where I think she needs to leave a scene emotionally, and that would never go as planned. So I learned to sort of let that go really quickly. That was something that I kept having to remind myself of, thinking, we haven't seen that side or we haven't been there yet, and just trusting that right here, right now is really important for where she's going to go, wherever that may be. Yeah.
It's not like they can go to the books either, since the writers have changed so much from their origins down to their personality and motivations. Seriously, Fringilla is supposed to look like Yennefer enough that Geralt gets seduced by her, but have such a different personality that he eventually moves on.
Fringilla, he answered after a while. You're a woman a man can only dream about. My fault, my only fault, is that I don't have the nature of a dreamer.
It should not be that they have a similar energy like Hisric says. That's like the complete opposite of the books. The whole point was that Geralt's attraction to Fringilla was skin deep. That was literally the whole point. How did you miss that? I just feel bad for these poor actors. They are performing blind to a script being misinterpreted by the directors, written by showrunners who can barely create a coherent storyline as they try to do their own thing while also doing an adaptation. When characters evolve, it's not because it makes sense within the context of the story, it's because who's helming the episode has changed. So it's not depth, it's not moral complexity, it's just inconsistent writing and directing. This all gives the impression the show was an incredibly disorganized production, with people finding solutions to problems on the spot, working around dumb constraints that could have been easily avoided with a bit of coordination and forethought. It's kind of fascinating, really. I have never seen a show so explicitly convey the difference between writer and director. The writers simply put a story into text, which is then interpreted and translated into image and sound by the director. In a TV show, it is vitally important to have someone who can helm the whole thing, since different episodes are handled by different directors who may not even be aware of the overarching storyline. You need to make sure the directors don't misinterpret the text, leading to conflicting style and characterization. That's the showrunner's role.
And I kind of just make sure that it's all staying in the initial vision that we all set out.
Yet here, the production team was a complete mess, hiring directors they didn't mesh with.
I sort of direct the vision of the show, but one of my personal ways that I like to run a room is that I don't ask everyone to sound just like me. I don't ask them to mimic my style.
Sakharov was supposed to be far more involved in the show originally, working on the look of the series and being credited as an executive producer. All for that to completely fall apart when the key creatives couldn't actually work together.
That's the thing that is really hard to put your finger on, because when you are taught to be a writer, you are not taught that the management of people is part of your job. In fact, you're taught that you're supposed to spend all of your time alone.
So we come back to the big question. Why hire him and Cavill? When key figures repeatedly drop out due to creative differences, you know there's an issue somewhere in the production pipeline of the show. It tells us one of two things. Either the show completely shifted gears at midway through production, transforming the book-accurate show Alec and Cavill originally hoped for into something completely different, or they were hired because of their pedigree and the showrunners knew it would play well with fans, rather than because they could contribute something to the show. In other words, so that Netflix could release a press release stating that Superman and a key director behind Game of Thrones were working on this new fantasy show and build anticipation among broader audiences. Honestly, I couldn't tell you which one it was since I wasn't there, but both are evidence of weak creative vision, focusing far more on financial success than on actually producing a good show, let alone one true to the source material. But if you think I'm done with these internal tensions, think again. It's probably the most interesting aspect of this whole thing. Another team member that was promptly dropped after the first season was costume designer Tim Aslam. Much has been said about how their work on costumes for the show was kind of all over the place and wildly inconsistent in quality. But at the same time, it appears Aslam never even had the tools necessary to deliver something of quality. When he was hired, the showrunners never gave him the context to prepare.
To do the concepts, I had like a week from like pen and paper to setting the costumes to be made, because obviously I had to make like 250 sets to be shooting in less than 2 months from sort of zero. And those scenes were already set, the locations were set. We could not move those scenes. So it was like, damn, we have to have this armor ready. It has to be done. And I was, guys, we need a sign off on this armor. What do you want?
I mean, was it quite difficult working with Anya's character? Because obviously at the beginning, she's a very different appearance. She's got the hunchback, she's got everything else.
Again, it was hard to know. The prosthetic was very late and there's a lot of discussion about it. So I sort of had to start making her costume just because of time without knowing what her full look would be. Lauren, which is the thing that I didn't know as well, because I hadn't really picked it up on the books, that she only wears monochrome, black, white, grey.
How is this possible? How is your team supposed to produce anything when they don't even know who the characters being depicted on screen are? This is insane. It's blatantly obvious that Aslam had little to no time to prepare and research when making the costumes for the show. As he puts it, we were going into a fast production process, so it was very important that we had everything we needed. In fact, this can be a little intimidating because you have to rely on your instincts. Sometimes, even for a character that's not been written yet, you will need to have the materials on hand. He was just trying to get work out the door.
On top of everything else, it was pretty difficult sometimes to just have the physical time to do it.
And the end result is stuff that didn't work, like Season 1's Nilfgaardian armor, which I will discuss in more detail in Part 5. When you look at concept art, it's easy to see how it could have worked, but the lack of time sabotaged any chance of that. The same thing happened with the Dryads. They were conceptualized as this cool idea of tree bark-like armor, but wound up looking like nothing more than tribal women. But even among the things that weren't as egregious, we have ridiculous stuff like this dress. Not only does it completely break Yennefer's firmly established rule of only wearing black and white, but on top of that, it's completely impractical for the context. This stupid-looking fashion statement is what Yennefer wears during the final battle of the season. She is at Sodden Hill, yet she is wearing a costume she can barely move in.
It was, to Anya's huge credit, it was a really heavy dress when it was made. It weighed something like 25 kilos.
Wow.
So
how the hell is poor Anya Charlatra supposed to act out action scenes when wearing something that is insanely inappropriate for the context?
We ran so many times. I thought I was going to faint by the end of it. We had to keep changing our shoes as well. Like, I had heels on to begin with. I had to change them to, like, snow boots because we kept slipping over.
They designed the dress without considering the comfort of the actors while they perform on screen, because they thought it would look interesting rather than if it made sense. And I mean, come on, even the games, for all their pandering to the male demographic, understood that when it came to battle, maybe a dress is not the optimal option. Even when they give women proper armor, they still look uncomfortable in it, and that's probably because it wasn't tailored to them. It was designed first, potentially before the actors were even cast, and then they hoped it would fit the actors.
Sort of actors flying at you, because obviously there's a lot of very late casting too. I had to have already know what I was going to do, and because there was so many, if I'd had an idea for an actor's costume, but in the meantime done sort of 20 others and it comes, had I not had that already drawn up, I would have just got into a huge muddle and I would have never got through it. So
even leads like Cavill had issues, who looks like he's about to tear his costume apart. In fact, apparently he did.
So of course, when you put that much strain, and especially the leather trousers, which he wanted tied, which invariably stretch, and leather is skin at the end of the day, so too much tension on it in the wrong place is gonna rip.
And as funny as that story is, it does indicate that perhaps the costume wasn't properly tailored to him. This is all the more obvious when you look at how often he wears his costume in combat. 3 times all season. That to me indicates Cavill couldn't properly move in it, opting for a simple shirt instead so that he could do his stunts.
The scenes like the early fight with Renfrey, he chose to sort of, and it worked with the story that he didn't have any armor on because it freed him up with movements and everything that he could do, because that stun fight as it became, I think would have been pretty impossible to do with all that armor on.
In fact, they've confirmed that's why they redesigned his costume in Season 2.
Henry can actually raise his arm and touch his sword, which was really important to him and me, because in Season 1, his arm couldn't go any further because of the design.
The lack of preparation means the showrunners were just spending money on costumes that were not even built for the situations the actors were getting tossed in. Even when they looked great, they were completely impractical. And again, that's on the production team that didn't give Aslam the time and information he needed to accommodate the needs of the actors.
So, yeah, he got into the role quite well and quite quickly, given that it was such short time, I would say.
And even then, the direction Aslam was given seemed generally pretty muddled.
Because one of the things that I discussed with Lauren earlier on is that she didn't want, the old medieval world kind of look to it. She wanted something. It was like, we don't want anything Eastern. We don't want anything traditional. We don't want Renaissance armor. We don't want medieval armor, just black. You know what I mean? It's like, it needs to be something never seen before, which in terms of armor is not an easy call, because armor's been around since, 3,000-4,000 years in various forms. So I think just about everything's been seen before.
It really seems like the showrunners knew they didn't want a historically inspired setting, probably in an effort to distinguish themselves from the games, but not really what they wanted in lieu of that.
But the show can't just be my brain and my voice. So what I like to do is sit back, let the discussion happen, pick and choose the things that I think are working well. Sometimes I will say, I don't think that works at all. But if everyone else loves it, convince me. Tell me why it works. Get me on your side.
And I guess that could be fine so long as it's a collaborative process of trial and error, working together to figure out what does and doesn't work. But that never happened here with the short prep time, leaving Aslam to kind of venture on blind in terms of determining the show's aesthetic. And you can kind of tell the inspiration for costumes is all over the place, ranging from Victorian Gothic to medieval and Renaissance to modern high fashion. And sure, it's a fantasy world based on a book series that often played with anachronism, but first of all, I need to mention it's kind of shitty to take an Eastern European fantasy series and not introduce any traditional Eastern European outfits, to instead focus solely on Western fashion. But beyond that, the real problem is there's no meaning behind the costumes. In actual well-thought-out shows, costumes have a purpose. The colors and fashion indicate the cultures of the characters' homes, and opposition in aesthetics can reveal alliances or rivalries without even saying a word. Changing a character's wardrobe can subtly indicate how they are evolving. Television is a visual medium. Of course, costumes would be incredibly important in conveying who a character is. But in The Witcher, there's none of that. Sure, the leads change their wardrobe as they evolve, but those changes seem more the result of the replacement of Tim Aslan by Lucinda Wright than anything else.
Season 1 was very fantasy, but I think for season 2 we went into a darkness, especially after COVID. When the scripts came back, it went into a real dark.
Like seriously, in what world does it make sense for Yennefer to suddenly introduce into her wardrobe gold and purple, which are generally viewed as regal colors, when she is in hiding and has lost the power that gave her any sort of status? Beyond that, every nation has every fashion, as the northern realms all blend in this mishmash of different ideas. There's no pattern, no order or logic to who gets what costume beyond the whims of the designers. For a show that jumps around space and time as much as this, costumes could have served as a clue as to what timeline or area we're in. But no. This is all part of the reason why, for all its claims of being an epic, this show never feels large in scope. We are supposed to be witnessing a war between several kingdoms, all with their unique culture evolving over decades. But look at these characters and try to tell me which is which. You can't, because there's no actual world building behind any of it. There's never any actual sense of place or history. The styles are all so disjointed that you really can't tell what's unique about each, which is even more noticeable given the showrunners didn't even attempt to attribute specific accents to nations, instead allowing the actors to do as they pleased. There is no coherent background to this world, no vision of how cultures or traditions developed. They refuse to take inspiration from real-world history to instead give us something far more fantastical, but never delved into what that entailed. Honestly, the show's understanding of world building is showing different looking CGI establishing shots that hint at a varied world. But once you actually close in, it's all the same dark, desaturated mess of dirty streets populated by filthy peasants, no matter where you are in the continent. They never gave the designers tools to actually envision the world of The Witcher as a real place with a history. They tasked them to create this thing that had never been seen before, but with none of the information necessary to bring that to life.
I hate micromanaging. I will not do it. I believe that I hire really amazing creative talents and then I need to trust them to do their jobs.
And as a result, we wound up with this meaningless collection of aesthetics. Ultimately, I just feel bad for Aslan. He's been constantly criticized for his work. Historic has in no small part played into this, acting very unprofessionally by constantly mocking the costumes of the first season.
I had written episode 1 by that point, or Declan had written episode 1, and it says on page 2 or 3, piles of Nilfgaardian armor burn to the ground. And we talked about how important that was. It was very, very important, that bit.
Like, that's just her backhandedly insulting Aslam's work, even though none of that was his fault. It was hers.
The approvals process during shooting is nutty because basically everything has to pass in front of my eyes.
And, I did some different designs and Lauren signed off on the one she liked. So that was the sort of the thing for it.
None of these costumes could get made without her approval. This is on her. She gave the go-ahead because clearly she had no better ideas of her own.
I've never been a solitary writer. So when I learned that television is written collectively, that you break stories as a room and you bring your ideas to the table and someone else will bring a different idea. And sometimes theirs is better than yours, or sometimes you blend them together. That sort of collaboration of writing is the most exciting thing to me.
What was your particular personality in that room?
So I am the one who sits back and takes it all in.
And the fact that Season 2 really didn't represent any major increase in quality, outside of one obvious example, really hammers in that Aslam was not at fault for this. Ultimately, the change in designers did very little to improve the show's aesthetic. With both seasons, time seems to have been the biggest constraint, and what little was improved was probably more the result of learning from Season 1, as the team got clear examples of what worked and didn't among fans, which helped Lucinda Wright at least refocus a bit.
So we learned on the day sometimes about restricted movement and what was working.
When I met Henry, I said, where do your elixirs come from? And he said they magically came out of nowhere. So I thought, well, why don't we make something?
But that's it. Once again, the showrunners hired someone that they didn't communicate with or didn't work well with, and when that blew up in their face, they just cut ties with him. And inherently tied to the costume department is makeup, who had a similarly awful time. They had to work on the fly rather than being able to figure out what worked and what didn't ahead of time. As I've stated before, Geralt's makeup changed midway through production, which is hilarious when the first thing we ever saw of this show was a poorly received screen test. They knew Geralt's wig was a problem, yet once production was started, they were still constantly modifying it.
And Jackie Rathore, who does my hair, she's my hairstylist, she was in charge of the wig, and she didn't get to build the wig. And so then she kind of adopted it, and then she worked in it and worked in it. She was taking it home every evening taking it home. She was dreaming about that darn thing.
And I'm incredibly thankful to those ladies for doing such a hard job, not just every day, but every night as well. They took their work home with them, and Jackie made sure that wig was looking perfect. There were 3 wigs, and they all went through different processes, and she was having nightmares about it. Right, Jack? Where are you?
As Cavill puts it, we tried several versions of a full white wig, and you can still see scenes of it in episode 1 before the reshoots. It glowed on screen, looking almost grandma blue under the lights. It was an abomination and laughable. If it's an abomination, then why is it appearing on screen in the first place? This is all stuff that should have been resolved ahead of time.
Through the season, you can tell, and you're like, that's where it starts to look really good. And that's after Jackie's had her hands on it for a while.
How they decided to start shooting before they were 100% sure it worked is beyond me. The production should not require the poor makeup artist to take her work home with her in order to modify the wig to the point that she had nightmares about the fucking thing. Their messed up production cycle was actively impacting the health of their employees. Like, I'm not even kidding here. Anya Charlatra has confessed that her back prosthesis caused her to have a trapped nerve in her back. And while she can claim the pain helped her performance, the fact that this happened for no other reason that they didn't take the time to plan things better is scary. Ultimately, the makeup team were not given the time to prepare, and that led to some serious discomfort among the actors that in all likelihood negatively impacted their performance.
The lenses, I can't see anything.
Really?
My lenses, yeah, I'm like, they're a prescription, I had my eye test and everything, but still, I just couldn't see anything in the lenses, anything like sort of further than this. So you ever see me like squinting, it's just I can't see anything.
It's one thing to hastily throw together cheap-looking contacts that are obviously drifting apart and giving all the actors googly eyes. It is another when those contact lenses almost did serious damage to Henry Cavill's eyes. We tend to romanticize the suffering of artists as a necessary sacrifice in filmmaking, putting on a pedestal this idea that film requires pain. But usually, the expectation that comes with that is, the final result be good, which it clearly wasn't. Despite everything they put their actors through, the filmmakers behind the scenes couldn't even keep the color of their characters' eyes consistent, sometimes straight up forgetting to color correct them in post.
Trust me. It's all you'll ever need. It's everything.
The showrunners put their cast through grueling conditions, clearly cutting corners left and right, and it was for a final result that looked like this. Because not only was pre-production affected by the lack of proper communication between showrunners and team, so was post-production. The VFX team at Cena's site had to endure constant constraints that clearly made their work harder. Rather than properly coordinating with the studio, the showrunners just did their own thing while ignoring how this would negatively impact the work of all the VFX artists down the pipeline. As VFX supervisor Alexander Payik explains, by the time I arrived in Budapest, the sets had already been built and the crew was ready to shoot. We worked closely with production supervisor Julian Perry, providing information not available on set that would affect the filming of the visual effects. The production provided previews and storyboards based on concept work, but once the set had been built, changes were required, which basically meant we started over. This is in regards to the Kikamura scene, the very first scene of the entire goddamn show. The filmmakers literally just built sets without consulting with the people tasked to make it look good, leading to a post-production mess. And sure, it wound up looking great, but that's probably because they spent more time on this scene than any other. Hell, it was originally supposed to be longer, but they shortened it. Sure, maybe for pacing, or maybe, just maybe, it was because the production clearly kept flip-flopping on what they wanted and how they wanted it, which led to work getting scrapped for no other reason than bad management. And it explains why effects look far less impressive the further into the show we go. They were throwing money at the wall without having a clear direction. Budget management must have been a mess.
I feel like they blew their entire VFX budget on the opening scene of the first episode.
Yeah, 100%.
Which probably led to the infamous dragon from episode 6. As Payek further explains, we followed the storyboard design and pre-production, although the look of the dragon changed significantly during production. We went through several iterations to get the look that the client felt was right for the character. And this one stings, because I genuinely love the concept art they did for the dragon. Like, I think it is a really, really cool take on an old classic. So why the hell did the final model end up looking this damn bad? While iteration is normal in VFX work, the fact that it arises seemingly because of communications issues is not.
You know, I think the root cause of the shot here, and what makes it seem weird, is the fact that they're blending a live action plate that's in a challenging lighting scenario with a CG dragon, whereas I feel like if you were to reapproach this shot, it would probably be better to make the entire environment 100% CG.
The showrunners seemingly didn't listen to the VFX team's advice on how to shoot scenes, on how to design characters, or on how to frame action, and that meant work was constantly scrapped. The producers didn't know what they wanted, and they never gave the VFX artists the information they needed to do their job properly.
So a showrunner is exactly, well, what it sounds like. And this is the person who is completely in charge of the tone of the show, the stories of the show, the style. It really is setting up the world, the characters, and everything you want to happen.
Where does the myriapod come from? I remember that we asked our client this question, because we always want to have the backstory. It informs the character design if the creature comes from this place, or if the creature perform this type of task in his daily life, this is going to influence how it's shaped, how it moves. So we asked our client this question: where does it come from?
What was the answer?
I think he said, it comes from like outer space, like another dimension, but it was very, very blurry.
You know, there's so many different creature concept designs for monsters. These things all come through me first, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, and that we're all continuing to have a shared vision of what The Witcher is.
On the Queen Leshy, there was a backstory. She's the queen of the forest. Eskel Leshy is a witcher that gets infected. All of this was very clear. The myriapod comes from outer space.
Yeah, weird creature coming from the outer space.
Just as the lack of world building by the showrunners undermined the hard work of the costume department, so did it undermine the hard work of the VFX department. And look, this isn't necessarily uncommon in the industry. A lot of productions go through this, unfortunately. But it does explain why this show kinda doesn't look all that good. The problem is not with Cinesite. They've done some breathtaking work on larger scale shows than this. Hell, they've done great work within this very show. And with a production cost of $10 million an episode, which even if you account for inflation, is more than the early seasons of Game of Thrones, shows it wasn't budget either. The issue lies with the people producing, who rushed to film scenes with little to no consideration for how it would influence the people who handle the footage down the pipeline. They designed set pieces, choosing shooting locations and built sets without the inputs of the people who were supposed to make it all look good.
It was quite a special journey to go there. You know, we had really tough locations with the crew will have to trek through the forest for 45 minutes to find those beautiful bits of forest and cliff that we shot through. Very little lighting that we could take with us, no electricity, but we've pulled it. And
they shot action in inefficient ways that actively made the work harder, and on top of that gave the artists muddled directions leading to subpar visuals. And this even bleeds into the cinematography and editing. And look, I'm not a stickler for continuity issues. As a video editor, I get it. But here, the flaws in the editing demonstrate a lack of forethought on the part of the filmmakers. As a simple example, look at this scene from the fan favorite opener of Season 2. Seems fine, right? But what was that? Here. and here. They just reused the exact same take twice. Don't believe me? Look, you can even see Ciri running around in the background, even though she's supposed to be somewhere completely different at this part of the scene. The filmmakers clearly didn't provide sufficient coverage for the editors to build tension, and as such, were forced to stitch something from other parts of the scene. They were using footage of one part of the choreography and injecting it elsewhere to complete the scene. And if this was a one-time thing, a flaw born from a COVID-hindered production, I'd be willing to excuse it. But it's not. This has been happening since episode 1 of season 1. The show is quite simply rife with minor editing blunders like this one, that while they might not bother the average viewer, are obvious to anyone who has spent any time in an editing booth. Simple things like this cut that makes it look like Yennefer is looking at Yennefer because clearly they forgot to shoot an establishing shot of what she was looking at.
Safe conduct.
Or this that cuts back to Iced even though he hasn't even left the frame yet.
Law of surprise has been called. You kill them?
That in editing language are just wrong. The uneven pacing makes it just feel like we're watching random shots getting slapped together. This time of aimless match cutting is not a stylistic choice, it's a salvage operation, born out of necessity as the editor probably didn't have any takes that were usable. Either that, or the showrunners asked the poor editors to shorten episodes until the whole thing became completely incoherent, which we know they're prone to do. Look at this cut that sees Geralt teleporting outdoors, which makes it evident they just removed a sizable chunk of the fight, probably to reduce VFX costs. And look, if we're talking about editing in Netflix's The Witcher, we kinda need to talk about Blood Origin, the 6-episode miniseries that was edited down to 4 to such a degree it destroyed what little potential was there to begin with.
And when we got in the editing room, the thing I always remember with great movies is, oh, this movie's great, and then it's 3/4 way through and you start going, come on, man, please don't do the thing, and then they go just that little bit too long.
It didn't make sense to have a lot of pauses in those stories. Declan had written, honestly, some beautiful scenes of people around campfires and sort of slowing down. But once we got into editorial, it was really, really clear that we needed to keep the momentum moving so that you can actually sit and watch it all in one, go. It flows like a movie.
You want it to be a good punch in the face, concise, and you want to go through it and be taken on a ride. So I never wanted any bit where someone was going like that. So in the editing room, it came out as 4, so it was great.
They literally cut at least 2 hours of footage to keep the pace up, removing scenes that were meant to build characters and their bonds. Characters just teleport out of nowhere with no explanation, sometimes no introduction. For instance, Sindral is in a cell, and the next time we meet him,
I escaped and vowed to destroy the gate.
He's fine. There was probably a whole subplot for his escape involving this character who happens to disappear around the same time. But that's all gone. All that drama, all that character building, anything of substance. It's all replaced by a narrator they brought in reshoots.
6 lone outcasts, strangers to each other, destined to be bound together in a blood quest.
Instead of letting the story unravel naturally, they just tell us what is happening, the very antithesis of the most basic rule in storytelling. Show, don't tell. And the sizable chunk of the dialogue between characters is also done in ADR, removing any sort of emotion the actors can convey.
ADR is automated dialogue replacement, sometimes also referred to as dubbing, looping, or post-sync. These are processes where an actor's on-set vocal performance is replaced in post-production with audio from a studio performance, possibly by a different actor.
I can't believe they united the armies. And the closer we get to Zentrea, the worse our odds.
Then we change the odds with the best blade in the land.
Who?
My old swordmaster.
ADR is a problem-solving tool, and it can be very good at solving problems. That said, heavy use of ADR is a sign that there were a lot of problems that needed solving.
At the end of the day, I'm sorry, but there's no other way to put it. This bad editing is ruining what should be dramatic moments. On set, little to no consideration seems to have been given to the various aspects of production, and it led to awkward cinematography like this shot of Borscht falling off a cliff in slow motion that wasn't shot in slow motion. Like, look at it. He's just moving slowly to simulate slow motion. The shot wasn't actually filmed at a higher frame rate. This one is just baffling. It's supposed to be this emotional moment, and it just looks awkward, and I feel embarrassed for everyone involved. Everything looks cheap, held together by some poor grip trying to answer the needs of the directionless creatives. Even the most simple scenes feel held together by duct tape.
This was just a girl using her magic to stop her mother from gutting her lover. Nothing more.
Look at this! This scene is an opposition between two parties, one on the left side and the other on the right, as we see in this establishing shot. Only for them to switch positions. And that'd be confusing enough on its own, but then they switch positions again later, randomly. There is no consistency in the geography of the scene for reasons I cannot wrap my head around. I do not understand how professional editors let this go by. It's not conveying anything about the debate. It's not done often enough to be a stylistic choice. It's just breaking the 180 rule for no reason, probably because the editor was missing a shot and so grabbed some random B-roll they had lying around. The direction was so all over the place that the editors and VFX artists were forced to pick up scraps and try to fix it in post. But sometimes you just can't. Sometimes you just wind up with awful editing. There's no dialogue between shots, which leads to mixed messages, as I've discussed in length. There is just footage missing all over the place here. And because the editors didn't have the footage they need, the poor artists try to fix things however they can. The character scenes overuse Dutch angles and wide-angle lenses to create the illusion of drama, rather than actually building up any tension through cinematography and editing, making the show look cheaper than a CW drama. The color grading is attempting to make the bland cinematography more interesting by pushing the saturation and post-processing effects through the roof, making everything look like it's gone through an Instagram filter. And even the action, the one thing the showrunners consistently injected by inventing new monsters and situations to put the character in, are also shot awfully. Seriously, when you look at the proposed choreography by the stunt team, it looks so much better than what wound up on the screen. I can actually tell what is happening, and I can appreciate the work put in by the stuntmen and the actors. But in the final result, stuff is happening, but none of the nuance, subtlety, and precision is there, probably because the actors had no time to rehearse. As Cavill puts it, throughout the shoot we were working with Vladimir Furdik. It was difficult to find time. He was often sending me videos of a fight, which they had to put together a day before I was supposed to do the fight. And I was working that day anyways. So I'd watch the videos at night, come in, then rehearse the fight and shoot it the next day. So it was very difficult to finesse some of the pieces. Clearly, they had no time to prepare, so they did what bad filmmakers do and hid the flaws with shaky cam and editing the cuts every 2 seconds. And the rest was hidden behind slow motion effects that only make everyone feel floaty and reduces the impact of the choreography. It's really not surprising Cavill took things into his own hands and personally brought in people to redo the Blaviken fight when you look at the show's baseline. The directors ignored the stunt team and did their own thing instead, not giving actors time to prepare, reducing any potential to naught. And as is tradition with this show at this point, the stunt coordinator Vladimir Furdik was disappointed with how their work came out and quit the project. And can you blame him? The guy was the Night King on Game of Thrones. Clearly he knows his stuff, but none of that came out on screen due to the amateurish way everything was handled. The way the showrunners consistently managed to undermine the work of talented individuals, wasting their time and energy, is nothing short of impressive, honestly. At the end of the day, the production appears to have been a stressful disaster. As Cavill puts it, I was working insane hours and it was exhausting. All the players, whether it be writers, filmmakers, actors, members of pre-production or post-production, were on a different wavelength with no clear force driving the show in a unified direction. Making any sort of film or show is hard. Most productions go through at least one of these issues at some point or another. But here, it's like every single thing that could go wrong did, all because the production had no true lead, instead getting dragged by a collection of different egos all fending for control, leaving the poor crew to work double and triple time to try and make sense of any of it. Seriously, this show was so chaotic. When Freya Allen was cast as Ciri, she didn't even know what role she had gotten because she had originally been selected for a different part. And that happened because Ciri was originally written as a 12-year-old before the team realized that her scenes were at night and it would cause issues in regard to child labor laws.
And we actually started by looking at someone much, much younger. Ciri in the books is around 11. Yeah. And we started there, and very quickly we sort of aged up the process. But what's great about Freya is she was actually cast as another role at first. a much, much smaller role in the first episode. And when we hadn't found our Ciri yet, we had seen over 200 girls and we hadn't found our Ciri. And Sophie Holland, our casting director, said, I want you to think about Freya for this.
The production crew never even considered that what they wrote and what they imagined might not be realistically brought to screen, leaving the casting directors to find solutions on the fly. For all their boasting about the team being a family, about how they manage things with empathy, kindness, and respect, I'd be really curious to see if the crew feel the same way after the ridiculous schedule they were subject to due to poor management. If anything, what little we know paints a picture of a fairly toxic work environment that exploited the goodwill of the team who wanted to be a part of something special.
For most of us, this is like one of the biggest and best things that we've done in our career so far, and I think we're all just so excited to be part of it.
Season 1 was shot without an intimacy coordinator. For a show with this much TNA, not having some form of person to help make sure everyone is comfortable, instead leaving that responsibility on the actors, is not just irresponsible, it's downright unethical.
Once you get into production, you've got a show of 400 some people. At the most we carry a crew of about 800 people. And these are people who are all coming in with their own passions and thoughts and ideas, but they also just need to feel like they are being heard or being taken care of. And that is the thing that I had no concept of.
I'd be curious to know how comfortable Anya Charlotra was when shooting sex scenes with a man 15 years older than her. And the fact that once they actually brought in an intimacy coordinator in the second season, the show cut back a huge amount on the sex and nudity really makes me believe the actors weren't at ease during that first season and just going with the flow to keep their job.
I think season 1 for me was a lot about facilitating conversations, making sure that actors were comfortable with their scene partners and you can reach out. And I didn't have to do any of that in season 2.
Beyond the actors feeling discomfort due to management's lack of consideration for their needs, the very public conflicts as members of the team such as Bo DeMaio and Matt D'Ambrosio accuse each other of being toxic on social media demonstrates something is off. A professional doesn't just throw former colleagues under the bus, accusing them of hating the source material they adapt or of abusive behavior unless there is something going very, very wrong somewhere in this machine. Hell, Hisrik's deflection of the show's most criticized aspects onto others, such as Aslam's costume design, or her placing the fault of Eskel's highly controversial death onto the writer of the episode, highlights her complete lack of responsibility of ownership of this product and the awful way she is managing this show.
I run the writer's room when I'm in town. I have a number 2, Mike Ostrowski, who runs the writer's room when I'm not there, who's incredible. I sort of direct the vision of the show, but one of my personal ways that I like to run a room is that I don't ask everyone to sound just like me. I don't ask them to mimic my style. I want them each to own their own scripts. The writing staff, obviously, the show is on their shoulders, not on mine. There are 6 writers in addition to me and a support staff of 4, and their brains at work are really the ones that come up with these stories. I write the pilot and they just take the ball and run from there. I am not making myself an inherent part of every single process, not having to say yes or no to every single thing that passes by, but in fact empowering other people to do that. I have, I think, created a better show.
What's the word I'm looking for, Lauren?
There's no writer on this panel. I don't know what you're talking about.
And this is all the more obvious given the stream of departures of people wanting to respect the source material, from actors like Cavill to producers like Sakharov to stunt coordinators like Furtick to others I haven't even had time to mention, such as Sonia Belousova and Giona Ostinelli, the composers of the wonderful soundtrack of Season 1.
They're constantly presenting me instruments, things like hurdy-gurdies, and things that they'll be like, this is what was used, in ancient Poland in the year 300 to make, timpani sounds. Okay, great.
They were replaced in Season 2 by Shocker, an American who created a far more Western soundtrack, removing even more Eastern European influence from the show. Not to mention the less prominent actors that have to be recast due to unavailability during reshoots, such as the previously mentioned Millie Brady's Renfrey or Thorstein Rasmussen's Eskel. Honestly, the amount of time this has happened as they rush to make casting announcements only to go back on that later is one of the most obvious indicators of the mismanagement inherent to these shows. From Chris Fulton's Rience being recast after just 1 season, to Jodie Turner-Smith dropping out as the lead of Blood Origins before shooting even began, and many, many others.
Sophie Holland, our casting director, gets first and foremost all of the credit because she's the one that found these incredible actors to fill these roles. And she did a worldwide search. We cast everywhere. She flew everywhere to meet anyone who thought that they could embody one of these characters.
I mean, I was sort of super cheeky. I was allowed to be super cheeky at the beginning of The Witcher, where we sort of talked about European actors, and I was like, yeah, you know, I just think the only real way for me to like get to know them is to like go over to the countries and spend a couple of days there meeting actors. And God bless them, they did. They flew me over to several European countries.
The management style behind the show seems to have been act first, logistics later, as they hire people they can't work with long term.
What's the one lesson you've got from doing this first season that you're going to take and apply to season 2 then?
Oh God, there's so many.
Yeah.
You know, I would say the big thing is really pre-planning. What we really took from it is the ability to plan ahead. So, spoiler, all the scripts are written. They're done. We know what we're shooting. So the great news is that we have them all now, and we can make the plan. We can stick to the plan. We know what works and what doesn't work. And I don't know that making television is ever smooth, but I think there will be a few less bumps this time.
It's a big crapshoot. You hire people that you think will all go together, who will have the right blend of life experiences, who represent different types of writing. You bring them all in one place and you hope that it works. And the good news about The Witcher is it worked.
No i też byłem jednym z tych niewielu weteranów, którzy przetrwali pierwszy sezon i zostali z serialem, więc to też było doświadczenie na wagę złota.
Dużo osób z pierwszej ekipy nie przetrwało. No w porządku.
Ale to też nie wszystkie nie przetrwały z jakichś tam podejrzanych powodów. Po prostu to był trudny to był trudny sezon. Okay. Przenieśliśmy całą produkcję też do Wielkiej Brytanii. I nagle się okazało, że ludzi z tak dużym doświadczeniem przy Wiedźminie jak ja jest w ogóle niewielu, nie?
And the grunts at the bottom of the food chain just had to work harder as they tried to make this train wreck not veer too far off course.
And the truth is I so wanted to prove myself that I was determined to do a lot myself and kind of pulverized myself into dust on the ground. And then was helpful to no one. And what really shifted in season 2 was my understanding that, one, I didn't have to work so hard to prove myself. I was there, I was doing the job, and the show was good, and people were happy. At the beginning, I wanted to do everything myself. I thought that was my job.
Right.
And in fact, it's not at all. Starting season 2, I really took on this mantra of like, hire people I trust and then trust them to do their jobs.
But how? How does a production of this magnitude get so disastrously out of control? How can something that costs this much have so little drive behind it? Well, as is usually the case with these things, it's probably money and time. When you look at the facts, it's blatantly obvious the show was rushed out the door by Netflix. From its announcement to its release, only a bit over 2 years went by. It was announced in May 2017, and then Lauren Hissrich was announced as showrunner in December of that same year. So if we consider how long the show had an actual showrunner, it was absolutely no time at all. Less than 2 years for writing, budgeting, casting, location scouting, pre-production, shooting, editing, VFX, sound mixing. It is an insane production schedule. Even the show's producer, Eric Brackman, was saying in 2018 the show would in likelihood not be able to release by 2020 due to the script needing polish. The show wound up releasing in 2019, a year sooner. The show's producers themselves were shocked by how fast the production went. When you compare to other shows of the same magnitude, you realize how insanely fast they produced this thing from scratch. Regardless of the quality of any of these shows, it does reveal that in the case of The Witcher, they did everything in a fraction of the time of what is normal. It is no wonder the entire cast seemed to be constantly scrambling to keep up.
And we were very, very close to production, and we still didn't have Geralt.
I was there for about a month, maybe a month and a half before production started. So I got there quite late as far as pre-productions go.
It was such a frenzy that sometimes I didn't even get to set to see the costume shooting because I was busy doing something else. So it was like breakneck speed.
I had very little time to kind of form the younger Yennefer. So I struggled to connect with things that I would have liked to pay more attention to. I suppose with more prep, there could have been different ways of exploring that movement.
Sort of the new thing of the TV shows, which are this hybrid between television and film. The prep times on them are incredibly short. And on The Witcher, it was even shorter than it's like.
I wish I had more time to work on the movement of that. I left the job and went straight into The Witch, so I wish I had that.
It was a very tough day. We were shooting in this abandoned sort of quarry, and it was hot, and we had a lot to get done that day. And I know both the actors Royce Pearson and Anya Chalotra both felt like they hadn't gotten it. They felt like they'd been rushed and it just wasn't going to work.
Most of the time for a show that's starting from, say, ground zero, you need around 6 months prep. We started shooting the Blaviken scene, which is quite a big scene, on something like the 28th of October. So that was basically just over 2.5 months from zero to a full-on shooting show, which, as shows go, that is pretty, like, cutting it really, really, really fine. So...
Też na planie, no bo to też jest tak, że myśmy w pierwszy sezon weszli bardzo szybko. Tam był bardzo krótki okres prepu, tak zwanego. Właściwie weszliśmy w to w biegu. Ostatnie odcinki były jeszcze pisane, kiedy już zaczynaliśmy.
Coming back to the pilot, it was written in little to no time. Seriously, even though she was hired in December, by January, Hisrick was already tweeting about the pilot being written.
And it's the fastest pilot I've ever written. I wrote it in about 4 days.
You blew through your script for arguably the most important part of your show in less than a week, and the only person you were bouncing ideas off of was your assistant Haley Hall, who had never written or produced screenplay before. I cannot fathom how you can write a script in 4 days and decide that's good enough. I seriously can't.
It was greenlit very fast. I think that I turned in the script in January and I was in Poland in April researching, and we kicked off the writer's room in May. So it all happened really, really fast from that point.
Sure, the script underwent rewrites down the line, but it's an insane turnover rate, even for a first draft. I know I'm not a speedy writer, but this isn't normal. No wonder the themes are all over the place. The character motivations change on the dime, and the structure kills any drama. You can't possibly begin to properly conceive a coherent narrative in 4 days, and there's even less chance that you can probably plan out a seasonal arc in that time, which is ironic when you've butchered every character for the sake of that overarching plot. The pilot originally introduced Yennefer's character, before they realized it made the episode far too long, showing they had no actual outline for how to pace the show. Removing her from the pilot is probably why the pacing of the following episodes is all messed up, as they had to shift and cut a whole bunch of important scenes in order to give her introduction.
We didn't know it at the time, but as soon as we started shooting the episodes, and then as soon as they started showing up in editorial, we had episodes that, a director was turning in a cut that was 96 minutes long, and we were hoping that it would be under 60. We ended up kicking a lot of stuff out.
This is why the show has no depth, because there was no time to plan, to set a direction in which to take the story and characters. All the crew could do was come up with a vague idea of the themes they wanted the story to be about, such as family and bigotry, but without having the time to figure out how to execute it all. So everyone just brought their ideas, and it just sort of turned into this messy soup.
But the show can't just be my brain and my voice. So what I like to do is sit back, let the discussion happen, pick and choose the things that I think are working well. Sometimes I will say, I don't think that works at all, but if everyone else loves it, convince me. Tell me why it works. Get me on your side.
And to make sense of it all, they fell back on tired old tropes and cliches, and resting on shock value to generate any sort of reaction among audiences. All it was from the start was an empty, shallow series of loosely related events. And with that in mind, it explains so much. I guess that's all Netflix wanted. They fast-tracked a dumb fantasy show to production rather than give the writers the time to conceive something worthwhile. Putting out content was more important than the quality of that product. The goal with Season 1 was very obviously to produce something in as little time as possible, and then Season 2 was produced in even less time despite the COVID pandemic.
So, we go for, I think it's about 5.5 months, depending, give or take. Season 1 was much longer. Season 1 just took longer for us to do. But we feel for Season 2 that we've got a little more under control now.
And this accelerated production is all the more fascinating when you consider this show was originally supposed to be a film. Yeah, people tend to forget that these days, but Tomek Baginski was originally the driving force behind this adaptation. He directed the opening cutscenes for all 3 games and was pushing for years to bring the series to Hollywood. As far back as 2015, he was working with the Sean Daniel Company to produce a film based on The Lesser Evil and The Witcher short stories that would serve as a jumping-off point for a TV show. The film was in active production, with the script being penned by Tanya St. John, and was slated to release in 2017.
Były bardzo duże szanse, żeby premiera tego filmu była w 2017 roku.
W pierwszej czy drugiej połowie?
No nie w pierwszej połowie, to na pewno nie. Ale tam nie są wykluczone jakieś drobne przesunięcia, ale raczej celujemy w 2017.
We had actually been working to try to make a movie out of it with two of our other producers, Sean Daniels and Jason Brown.
But obviously that didn't happen. The Sean Daniel Company instead came to an agreement with Netflix to produce, and years of work were scrapped. Baginski, being an outsider to the Hollywood machine, was slowly but surely phased out of the project.
Także wiecie.
Ja pamiętam taką anegdotę, którą kiedyś opowiadałeś, że na tych pierwszych spotkaniach trochę cię lubili pomijać.
Wiesz co,
dawno temu, że,
ale to było
że
dawno,
musiałeś trochę sobie wykopać drogę tam do...
To było dawno temu i to też było trochę na takim etapie pracy, kiedy myśmy się wszyscy musieli poznać. Oczywiście na poziomie czysto kreatywnym, na poziomie literackim jest się trudno przebić, bo jest bariera językowa.
Instead of keeping a Polish lead who knew the source material but did not have sway at Netflix, the streamer turned to a more familiar option, Lauren Hissrich, who had already worked on Daredevil, Defenders, and Umbrella Academy for the distributor, and she hired writers and directors she herself knew from her experience on those shows. Their familiarity with the source material was never taken into consideration, as she just hired people she thought she could work with.
There's a few writers in the room who are complete gamers who didn't even know that The Witcher was books. They only knew the game. Then I have people who had never heard of The Witcher before, but who loved fantasy. And then I have someone who had never written fantasy before.
I didn't want to stack the decks with all book fans, who were worshiping Sapkowski and his work. Nor did I want to stack the deck with just all, video game fans. I also needed people who, like me, didn't know much about The Witcher when they first came in. They needed to love it by the time that they came onto the show, but I wanted them to grow and learn and love it, as part of their journey on this show.
Which in and of itself would be fine, but these folk had only a surface-level understanding of the source material while working on a production that was already going at twice the speed a show is usually produced at. All this did was relegate Baginski to a second-unit director whose real role seems to have been to give the crew crash courses on what the books were about.
Na początku mówiono, że będziesz reżyserował niektóre odcinki. Tak się ostatecznie nie stało. To powiedz, co Wiedźmin Netflixa zawdzięcza Tomaszowi Bagińskiemu?
Zarówno i Lauren, i Netflixowi zależało na tym, żeby wśród producentów, czyli jakby w tej grupie kreatywnej ponad reżyserami kontaktujący, kimś, kto się będzie kontaktował i z Lauren, i ze scenarzystami, i z Netflixem, żeby mieć kogoś, kto rzeczywiście rozumie ten świat Wiedźmina i był w tym świecie Wiedźmina od bardzo, bardzo wielu lat, więc dalej miałem bardzo duży wpływ kreatywny na serial. Oczywiście Lauren, która była showrunnerem, podejmowała najważniejsze decyzje i to jest jej adaptacja, to jest jej projekt. Głównie ja, ale też Jason Brown z Hive Mind i Sean Daniel, Jarek Sawko. Dostawaliśmy scenariusze do komentowania, do zmian, do wprowadzania jakichś sugestii, bo szczególnie na początku scenarzyści też musieli poznać ten świat, musieli jakby jeszcze bardziej zrozumieć tonację tego świata i to zajęło chwilę.
They needed someone who actually knew The Witcher and could absolve them of any accusations they were ignoring the franchise's Polish roots, but that's about all he did.
Tomek Baginski, who's one of our Polish producers, he's very well versed on the books and the lore of The Witcher, and there are certain things, that are not necessarily described in the scripts. We would run those things by Tomek and his team to make sure that we were staying true to the source material.
We have a Polish producer, Tomek Baginski, who's amazing and who is my immediate go-to for so many questions about so many things. And we see him mostly with his steel sword on his back. Coming into the series, I always assumed that he would actually use the silver sword more than he does.
Oh my goodness, we had so many different versions of the names.
Right.
Oh,
that
is
true.
So
that was
many
a problem. I think
versions.
Ciri was probably the easiest, but people really struggled. It's it's Geralt. It's not
Geralt.
Gerald or Geralt.
Yeah, Jaskier thinks Geralt is his best friend in the world. Geralt doesn't necessarily feel the same about Jaskier.
He doesn't necessarily say this about Jaskier, but I think he
feels it inside?
A little bit.
That was his job, to make sure the writers weren't completely off the mark. Do you see how crazy this is? They scrapped years of work, erasing the efforts of the people who had spent years with the source material. They replaced it all with stuff by people who were racing against the clock, writing when they weren't even familiar with the setting. No wonder this show has no world building to speak of, as the teams were left to their own devices to figure out what this show was even supposed to be. Even Lauren Hissrich, the damn showrunner, initially skipped Sword of Destiny, arguably the most widely loved book in the series and the most integral one to understanding Ciri and Geralt's relationship.
Blood of Elves was actually the next book that I read, and then reversed and read Sword of Destiny.
No wonder so many of the stories, characters, and themes are off, with clear misunderstandings of the ideas Sapkowski put forward. They read the books out of order, with gaps in their understanding of the characters and themes. They were building this show off a selective, partial appreciation of the source material, using Baginski as nothing more than a means to cut corners on research, to not waste time reading the books. How on earth were they supposed to set up this cinematic universe of shows, movies, and spin-offs, and show any sort of respect to the source material when they needed to be coached to even get the material? There's no way they could have set up any mysteries or build up any payoffs when the writers seemingly didn't even know where the story should be heading.
During that 5 months, I took the time to read all of the scripts, obviously, but not as individuals, but as this huge sort of 8-hour long movie. And it was interesting because that's not something that television really affords us the time to do.
When you hear Haley Hall's description of the writing process, where she says basically anything goes, stuff like having a character get a gruesome disease or a hero falling in love with a villain, both of which have happened in the show, by the way, even though they never happened in the books, you've really got to wonder how much knowledge of the source material they actually have, and how much is them just making things up on the fly with no foresight or knowledge of the story. Even now, years later, I'm not convinced all the writers have read the entirety of the series.
And I think something else that's really interesting is as we've gone along, we've all learned kind of what the tone of the show is and who these characters are. And it's really interesting as we go on to continue to develop that. Again, I think it's really exciting to see where the show will go to next.
Sapkowski, the writer, he had a natural end in mind. Now, actually, since we started the show, he has released more books. So we'll have to see how that fits into it.
I have no clue what Hissrich is talking about here. The last book, Season of Storms, released in 2013, years before she even heard of the franchise. So I really have no idea what book she is talking about here. And look, the reasons why Netflix forced these conditions on the team are obvious, right?
Do you think it is impossible in today's day and age to make an amazing fantasy show like this and not get those Game of Thrones comparisons?
Right. The Witcher is already being tagged as the next Game of Thrones.
Just from looking at the clip today. Now, that's your character. Geralt, okay. And then you've got the Khaleesi. And you've got the same hair as the Khaleesi. Really. We do. Yeah.
And do you think it's going to be as successful as Game of Thrones? Do you think it's going to be as popular as Game of Thrones? To which I would always say, like, God, I hope so. That's the dream, right? Is to have a show that resonates with that many people across the world. And knock on the wood in front of me, I think we're actually there.
And I think fantasy on television right now is amazing. And I'll just say it, Game of Thrones, really great show that we're huge fans of too.
In 2017, Game of Thrones was on its penultimate season. Its final season was slated for 2019. Anyone could see that a vacuum was about to appear in the TV space. Soon, the king of fantasy was going to be gone, and it was going to be a free-for-all on who could become the next big thing. Everyone was working on their fantasy show to try and corner that Game of Thrones audience. HBO was working on at least 3 different Game of Thrones spin-offs and his Dark Material. Amazon had their Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings projects. Meanwhile, Disney was also announcing they were getting into the streaming game. Of course Netflix would want to find its footing in the upcoming barrage of fantasy content. They fast-tracked this show in order to be the first major fantasy TV show based on a popular IP after Game of Thrones ended its run. They gave it a budget of $10 million an episode, a ridiculous amount for a first season. They cut corners. They kept pushing to continue production at the height of COVID, shutting down twice because of infections, and had several cast members suffer major injuries because rushing things out is more important than the health and safety of their employees.
This industry, the industry that we're in, shut down. I think we were the only television show shooting in the UK for quite some time.
Legitimately, they didn't give Cavill the time he needed to heal properly after his hamstring injury.
We did our best to stick to his rules of no more than 5 hours on my feet every day. But unfortunately, production requires more time, and so we had that very delicate balance of doing the right thing for my healing and then doing the thing that production needed me to do.
And if this were Cavill being too dedicated to the role, rushing to get back to work, whatever, that would be on him. But it doesn't seem to be the case. As he puts it, initially that was feasible. But as things went on, I had to work longer and longer. Eventually I said, guys, look, I know we need to finish this, but I can't because if I do injure myself again, then that's my career over, let alone this season. Yeah, This seems like a super healthy work environment. No wonder he left. Their goal was to be the replacement of Game of Thrones in the eyes of the audience, and the actual quality and care given the production was neglected. It was always obvious. The very first piece of marketing this show ever got was this awful screen test of Henry Cavill. Not key art, not a poster, not even a logo, a goddamn screen test. They didn't care what they put out there. They never took the time to make something that looked good. It was just about getting the word out as fast as possible so people would know this would be the show to follow up Game of Thrones. And that sentiment was only emboldened when Game of Thrones' final season wound up disappointing audiences. They knew people wanted something to wash away the bad taste that left. No matter how much history claims they didn't want to be the next Game of Thrones, when you look at the directors, actors, and crew they keep hiring, it's obvious that's exactly how they want to be seen. So there you have it. The show is bad because Netflix rushed it out the door, forcing the team to work under strict deadlines that meant no one could bring their A game in order to beat everyone else at the draw. Simple story of evil corporations screwing up good intentions. Except, that's not actually true, is it? At every opportunity, Lauren Hissrich has taken credit for this show. As she puts it, she is the strong, independent woman I'm looking to blame for this mess.
You're not helping!
Fine then. I was trying to keep it impersonal. I was more than happy to blame this disaster on the faceless corporation driven by evil suits imposing impossible deadlines on you. But if you are proud enough to take credit for this show's success, then you better be ready to take blame for its failures. I will consider it your work, and I'll criticize it as such.